Lean and hungry and offensive brute. Run, pass, or boot. This is the Bengals fight song. They play it after every touchdown. Get some points up on that board and win a game for Cincinnati. Which means they'll probably play it about 4 times this season. Why? Why? I'm a lifelong Bengals fan, Reds fan too. Here's the Bengals' 50th year. It was back in 2017. And 50 years, now 51 years of never winning a Super Bowl. I don't know why they're celebrating it, but they are. They actually been to the Super Bowl twice. Once when I was in 5th grade and once when I was a senior in high school, 1989. Lost both those. Their last playoff win was 1990. So just for a perspective of that, I was a sophomore at Miami the last time the Bengals won a playoff game. So I was 18 years old still. 18. I am not 18 anymore. That's the last time the Bengals won a playoff game. But here I am. I'm buying the gear. I'm got the swag on. Ready for another season of Bengals football. The only good thing about it usually is I get to make fun of the Browns. But now the Browns are good. I don't know. I'm not happy. Not happy at all. I don't even want to think about it. Anyway, it's good to see you. Although I'm not seeing you. It's good to see you. Got my coffee mug here, huh? Got my little Glee Club. I was in the Glee Club at Miami, so there we go. That's looking good. It's coffee, as far as you know. So let's get this party started, all right? You have your video supplemental. You should have that. It's called, what's it called? 9.9, so September 9th, 4th class supplemental. Grab that and away we go. Please don't forget to, you want your textbook with you. Make sure you read chapters 2 and 3 for our next class. You're taking a quiz at home based on those chapters, based on this lecture. So you can have your quiz out with you right now if you'd like to do that. That would make sense. Of course, anything we've covered so far might be on this quiz. So take notes as you go along. And here we go. I'll tell you a little story. It's 1996, maybe 5, and I'm a reporter at the Cincinnati Enquirer. So I'm working at the newsroom downtown, and a guy named Greg Noble had been the sports reporter or sports editor for the Cincinnati Enquirer for a bunch of years, and he decided to resign from that position to be the web editor for the Cincinnati Enquirer. We thought he was crazy. He'd worked all the way up to sports editor of the paper, going to 500,000 people, this newspaper, every weekend, and on Sundays, 400, 300,000 on weekdays. And we thought he was nuts. What are you doing? The idea of online news was a fad, we thought. Who in the world is going to read their news on a computer screen? Everybody loves holding on to an actual hard copy newspaper when they read their news. Now, we thought it was kind of cool that our stories could go online and that somebody in Topeka, Kansas or France could log in and read our stories where typically they could never read them, in a hard copy paper delivered to their door. So we thought that was pretty awesome. My mom and dad, who live in London, Ohio, could open up a computer if they knew how and read one of my stories. Oh, that's pretty neat. Nice. But it's not going anywhere. But Greg Noble saw it. He saw that this was the future of the way journalism was going to work. Unfortunately for him and for the Cincinnati Enquirer and for a whole bunch of other news organizations, they really screwed up because they gave away all these stories for free, all of them. And that's not good. Now it's not. Now you can read usually a certain select number of stories before you hit a paywall and you're supposed to pay. But there are ways around that. It's a mess. It's a total mess. And now that the legacy media companies have tried to start to charge for stories, you're getting a lot of backlash from people who are saying, I'm not paying for something that I used to get for free. It's like closing the barn door after the horses have already left. So that's a struggle, and this is why a lot of the money has dried up for legacy media. And the other problem, of course, is if I'm a Bengals fan, uh, if I want my Bengals news, I don't have to go to the Cincinnati Enquirer now. That used to be the pretty much, other than maybe radio or TV, the only way I'd get my Bengals news. But now I can go to ESPN.com, Bengals.com, Bleacher Report, NFL.com. There's a CincyJungle.com. I mean, on and on and on. And a lot of that information's free, so sorry, unless your content is extraordinary, I'm not paying for it. So this has crushed legacy media. The Cincinnati Enquirer on Sundays used to be this heavy, like 4 pound pile of newspaper with tons of ads, but Craigslist took care of that because now you can place your ads there. More people are going to see them there than they will in your local paper, and that's the big problem with legacy media is all of that has dried up. It has especially hit local newspapers hard. When I was at the Cincinnati Enquirer, this is 20 years ago, uh, I worked, we had three news bureaus. We had a bureau in northern part of Cincinnati called Tri-County. We had a bureau in Claremont County, which is the county east of Cincinnati, and we had a Northern Kentucky news bureau. Each of those bureaus had at least a dozen reporters, at least. We had a newsroom that was vibrant in downtown Cincinnati on the 19th floor, 312 Elm Street, with dozens and dozens of reporters covering all sorts of things. You had a movie reviewer. That position's gone. These days, there are no more news bureaus, so nobody's covering all these outskirt neighborhoods in Cincinnati in the north or the west. Nobody's covering Claremont County and those communities on the eastern side of Cincinnati. Nobody's covering northern Kentucky. You got a newsroom in downtown Cincinnati that's totally gutted. So if you are a school board member in Oxford, Ohio, and you are doing something shady, you're fine. You're good. The Enquirer's not going to be there. And so this is the scary part of what's happening with journalism is that all of these local news media companies just can't cover everything. They'll cover the fire or the murder, something major that happens, but all these things that are going on behind the scenes in town council meetings and school board meetings are largely going unchecked. And these news deserts are are the biggest shame of it all because as much as we like to talk about these national politics, the things that really affect us are the local things. So it's a scary time right now for journalism. Okay, let's see. The so the problem with not making a lot of money is that media companies have had to resort to tricks to make money. So this is on your supplemental. We're starting with number one, letter A. You can see there, this is from dailyliked.net. There's a link if you want to go to that underneath this screenshot that I took. And if you look at these headlines, you see that these are big teasers. You've got on the right, dancers swarm the stage for dirty dancing routine. When music starts, you won't believe their moves. Or the one below that on the right, hundreds of martial artists perform hauntingly awesome routine in perfect unison, and it's unlike anything you've ever seen. Um, and on the left, top left corner, they set up a camera in the forest and captured the most incredible scene ever. Well, you're promising an awful lot if you are capturing the most incredible scene ever. I mean, I've seen Caddyshack, and there are some incredible scenes in Caddyshack. But okay, I'm curious. You got me. You've done your psychological mumbo jumbo on my brain, and now I just gotta know what happened in the forest. So I'm gonna click on that and watch. And so if you want to click on that link, dailylike.net, and you probably will make them about 5 cents if you do that, and click on that camera and watch what happens. It really is the most incredible scene ever. I'm shaking my head because it's really not. But that's one way the media tries to trick you. This is called clickbait. And I know for a number of you, this is nothing new. You're like, yeah, reader, I know. But just in case, again, I need to know that you have this foundational understanding of what media was, what media is today. So this clickbait works, no doubt about it. It's hard sometimes to resist the headlines, even though you know you're almost guaranteed to be disappointed. So that's one way the media tricks you. And of course, as I go through this, you need to pause me to read some articles and look at things. You'll want to do that. The next thing, if you scroll down on your supplementals, letter B, are things like BuzzFeed, which got started by forcing you to click multiple times on an article. BuzzFeed used to have these things called slideshows. BuzzFeed has a lot of lists for their articles instead of traditional stories in traditional structure with paragraphs. So if you click on this link, um, this is a list of 22, I think, things that of how colleges. This is actually pretty funny. I have to give BuzzFeed credit. I mean, it's total sugar, not good for you entertainment at times, but I think you'll. I chose this one, of course, on purpose because you'll relate to it. I laughed. I admit you might laugh. Actually, you might cry because you're in the throes of what is happening to you right now in college versus high school. But these lists used to be in slideshow form. So every time you would read one of these tweets, then you'd have to click on another one. You'd have to click on it to go to the next one. And how media companies can, one of the ways media companies makes their money, number one, is the longer you stay on their site, the better. And then the second way is by the more clicks you make, the better. And so you can see why Facebook is worth billions of dollars because people spend hours and hours on Facebook and they click on pictures or they click on ads or they click on videos and all those metrics for sites like Facebook add up to a lot of money. So anyway, if you'd like to go through that list, I think you'd probably pretty much enjoy that if you want to pause me and read through it. Letter C on your supplemental is couching paid content. News organizations online now have headlines, but they will also have headlines that aren't from the news organization. They are essentially advertisements. This screenshot is from NBCnews.com, letter C, under number one. And you'll notice all the headlines there, but then you'll see the little green sponsored boxes. And you might have to zoom in on your screen on your Word doc to be able to see this a little better. But for instance, that picture on the right that says HelloFresh is bringing good energy back into my kitchen, and it says sponsored. Most people will see that and realize that's probably an ad, but I promise you, I'm going to say a majority of people don't realize that's an ad, and they think that the NBC News reporter has a report here on HelloFresh, and it's a positive report or an editorial at least, but it's an advertisement. HelloFresh is paying for that spot, just like over there on the right, how I broke my unhealthy eating pattern. That is a paid ad. Maybe it's Weight Watchers, maybe it's Jenny Craig, who knows? But that's one way that news or that media is helping to pay for their business is tricking you into clicking on something that you might think is news. And then finally, the last one is news organizations will pay for their content to go on larger sites. When Bleacher Report, which is a sports news organization, first started, I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, nobody was going to it. So they figured out, you know what, we're going to go to CNN, we're going to go to the San Francisco Examiner, we'll go to the Cincinnati Enquirer. We know those newsrooms are empty. We know that they don't have a sports team big enough to put content online. The same headline will stay online for 5 days. So we have a ton of reporters. We're going to do the reporting, and then we're going to put we're going to have CNN pay us, for instance, in this case, to run our stories, so it looks way more robust on CNN. Like CNN has a ton of reporters covering this stuff. So under the sports section, if you were able to click on Super Bowl's most feared player, that is a Bleacher Report story, not a CNN story, and it would actually take you to Bleacher Report's site. And so now suddenly Bleacher Report started getting a ton of viewers, and they ended up selling to Time Warner, maybe? I forget. Anyway, Bleacher Report sold its company after about 5 or 6 years for hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars That trick obviously worked very, very well. Well, it sounds like it's doom and gloom for local media, for the Cincinnati Enquirer, for the uh, Cleveland Plain Dealer, for the Pittsburgh Post Gazette, for the all these different newspapers around the country. But they're hanging in there as best they can. They're adjusting. Unfortunately, there are a number of my friends, people who have been in the business, the journalism business a long time, who got released, and so it's a painful adjustment for journalism, especially local journalism. But even with that, it's still a great time to consider not only a career in journalism but in marketing, PR, communications. Simply because there are so many news outlets now, way more than before, that you do have the opportunity to go and prove yourself enough to then move maybe into a higher level, more prominent position in communications. And if you have convergence, which I talked about in the last video, you have skills not only just in writing, but you can take pictures and you can do video and you understand social media metrics, then you become so valuable. You're more valuable than I am. I promise you that right now, and you'll have tons of options for careers. There's a kid, I say kid, he's 27 years old, who's a managing editor at the Cincinnati Enquirer. That would be unheard of 20 years ago. You'd have to be my age at least to reach that position. But he moved up the ladder simply because he's talented in a bunch of different ways and understands very well how media works right now. All right, so there you go. Chapter 2. This is going to be a very quick historical lesson on the media then and now. Uh, there are other journalism classes where you can get more into this. For the first time next semester, I'm teaching a 101 class in case you want to hang out with me again, where we do go into this a lot more. A lot less writing in that class, very little writing, in fact. It is more looking at the issues that journalism, that faces today, what journalism used to be. This is a news writing and reporting class, but in case you never do take an introductory journalism course, I do want to make sure you have all of this information. Again, when you go to Thanksgiving and Uncle Bill starts spouting off about something journalism related, you can be right there to be able to have that conversation with him. Back in the day, when I was a kid growing up, you got your news pretty much, at least on TV, with three stations. You had the big three, and that's NBC, CBS, and ABC. You had your local news came on at 6. That's it. I know local news now starts at 5 and goes till 6:30. It's like an hour and a half of news. It used to be 6 to 6:30 was your local news. 6:30 to 7 was your national news. That's pretty much it. You had your local news at night at 11, and for half an hour. That's all you had. No ESPN, no CNN, no Fox News, no cable channels at all. The big three: NBC, CBS, ABC. And you were loyal to one of those three. My parents were NBC people. That's all they watched. They loved John Chancellor. They loved Tom Brokaw. These were the news anchors, and that was pretty much the most prestigious job you could get in journalism, was to be a news anchor for the big three. If you click on number 2, that link, you'll see a picture of David Brinkley, and the guy I remember the most growing up in the 70s was John Chancellor. I loved John Chancellor, and then I loved Tom Brokaw after him. I'm still an NBC loyalist. That's one of my first places I go is NBC, and a lot of that is rooted into my own personal experiences growing up. If you notice John Chancellor and David Brinkley, you'll notice a trait about them. And also, at the time, Walter Cronkite was on CBS back then. You'll notice they're men, and you'll notice they're white. That is the prevailing trend in news journalism for a long time. You had to be a white man, and you had to have no accent, basically. You didn't see somebody from Boston reporting the news, nobody from the South reporting the news, nobody from Minnesota reporting the news, a nice Midwestern flat accent, and male gender and white was the only way you were going to make it on major national news. That's changed. Katie Couric became the first female news anchor for CBS about 15 years ago, but it's been pretty recently since that's happened. Lester Holt now is on NBC, African American man. So the inroads are finally happening, but it's still predominantly a white male dominated scene. Walter Cronkite's the most famous of them all. He was on CBS back in the 60s and 70s, and he was just about completely trusted by the vast majority of America, so much that they called him Uncle Walt. Imagine that, a person in journalism who was so trusted that people called him Uncle Walt. The Vietnam War was raging in the late 60s, early 70s, and and for the most part, the older people in our country favored the Vietnam War, and for the most part, the younger people were against it. Um, Walter Cronkite, of course, if you click on a link and kind of pause YouTube for a second, was older white male who generally went along with what the government said, which is we need to be in Vietnam and fight this. Until Walter Cronkite went to Vietnam, and Cronkite, when he went there, saw that the situation was just untenable, unwinnable, and that maybe it was indeed time to get out. So this is Walter Cronkite on the national news telling America that it's time to get out of Vietnam. So pause me and please watch this video. All right, so here's the most trusted man in America telling the country, and when you have only three networks, then about 30% of the country is watching you. And for Cronkite, it was higher than 30%. That's millions of people, millions watching you. Now, news is so diluted. Who knows, what news organizations you're watching TV, if you're watching TV at all. But back then, these big three had the lion's share of the audience. So here's what happened. All right, Cronkite says this on national TV. The president at the time is Lyndon Johnson. He had taken over when John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in November of 1963. Johnson was elected in 64. Okay, so Johnson is close to getting ready to run again in 68. Lyndon Johnson watches Walter Cronkite say this. And the story is he goes up to the television in the White House, turns it off, and says, and he was a proponent of Vietnam. And Johnson says, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost middle America. A few weeks later, Lyndon Johnson decides not to run for re-election. Imagine that. A sitting president decides not to run for re-election. And the major reason, or a major reason, is because of what a news man said about him. Imagine Barack Obama watching Fox News and Sean Hannity says something, and Barack Obama turns off the TV and says, well, if Sean Hannity says it, then maybe it's time for me not to run. Or imagine Donald Trump watching MSNBC and Rachel Maddow says something negative about Donald Trump, and Trump turns off the television and goes, well, if Rachel Maddow says it, then maybe I shouldn't run for president. We live in different times. There's no question about that. So with the thousands of options for news online and on TV and print and radio, social media, whom do you trust? When you look at that chart of all of the ideological mixture of organizations, whom do you trust? Especially when each organization seems to try its darndest to refute the other side. And now news is 24 hours, not just 6 p.m. And I talked about this a little bit in class. That same shooting is replayed over and over. And it's not news anymore once they report it the first time. Now it just becomes commentary. An athlete will do something on Sunday when the NFL starts. And you're going to have people analyze it and opine about it for hours and days. And they're fighting to be heard. That guy on ESPN is fighting with that guy on CNN, and that guy on CNN is fighting with the guy on Fox. They're all fighting to be heard. And so the more outlandish things they say and the way they say it, the better chance they'll be heard.